so welcome back to another fun and exciting adventure in the real business cycle world. Now, last time we set up the real business cycle model, we solved it out. As we saw, the money and utility function model really was just a subset of the real business cycle model. The real business cycle model, at least the one that we went over in the last lecture, included labor markets, which the money and utility function model didn't. I included labor markets in that because I kind of wanted to show the role that labor markets play in these types of models. Now, what this lecture is going to do is cover the supply side of the economy. So we're going to explain how, from the production function and from labor markets, we can derive a measure of aggregate supply in the real economy. Now, without further ado, I guess we'll just go ahead and get started. Now, if you remember, the firm wants to maximize their profits. I'll say firms max pi sub t, right? This capital pi, right? The lowercase pi is inflation. The capital pi is profits. Don't ask me why. I have no idea. It's just the notation. They abuse it. I guess technically I do, but I don't make the rules. Now, the firm wants to maximize profit. So what is profit, right? Well, it's total revenue just minus total costs, right? Everything that the firm earns from production minus everything that the firm has to pay from that production process. Right now, total revenue, getting ahead of myself. Is price times output. So total revenue is the price of the product multiplied by how many units of that product that we make. Right? Well, how do we account for how many units of the product that we make? Well, that's described by the production function. Gives us this right here. Y equals A times K to the alpha times L to the 1 minus alpha. Right, so we've got two inputs in the production function here. We've got capital and we have labor. Right, now most of the models that we've seen and most of the models that you've played with in the past only had capital, right, because they were per capita, and we basically were just sort of assuming that a lot of the stuff that was going on with the capital was actually capital per unit of labor. Right, so the labor was sort of like implicitly assumed within that model. Here, on the other hand, we're not doing that. Right, now this is still per capita, so to speak, but the labor and capital decisions aren't exactly like kind of one and the same. There's a little bit of mathematical trickery with that. Don't worry about it. Not a big deal. Now, if we have this, right, this is our production function. Actually, you know what? To be consistent with the notation that I had earlier, let's do that fancy L. So we have that instead. So this is labor, right? So we'll say KT is capital, LT is labor, right? And they require a certain combination of these two inputs in order to be able to optimize their production, right? To do so as efficiently as possible. Excuse me. Right, so they need a certain optimal combination of these two things to produce as efficiently and optimally as they can. Well, that's all well and good. But total revenue, right, is we're not too concerned about that stuff just yet. Right, what we're more concerned about is what total revenue is. Well, total revenue, if it's price times output, which is Y, and Y is equal to this, all I have to do is plug this in for Y. I get that. Now, total costs, well, that's just what I spend on capital and what I spend on labor. Right, so the nominal interest rate times the amount of capital that we use, plus the nominal wage rate times the amount of labor that we use. So if profits are just total revenue minus total cost, it's just this minus this. So I'll say capital pi t will just be this. And this is how the firm maximizes their profits. Now I'm not going to go through the derivatives on this stuff because it's not particularly important when it comes to actually looking at how this stuff works in a more static framework. Right, we're going to sort of implicitly assume that it's kind of already been done. All right, but this is what the setup for that would be, which tells me that I really have two markets. I've got capital markets and I have labor markets. Now we're going to be a little bit more interested in looking at how labor markets operate here than we are going to be capital. So, all that stuff aside, firms do their optimizing stuff, and they're going to get their labor demand, right? So when firms optimize, they get a demand for labor. Right, that demand for labor, excuse me, right, is dependent on, well, a couple of things. And if we were to solve out the optimization problem and get the general equilibrium and all that, we would see what it's all a function of. But I'll just tell us. Well, I will say, let's use LT into E, which I guess what I should probably do is be consistent with the notation again. Use that. This is lowercase l t d. This is a function, we'll call it L, of the real wage rate, capital, and productivity shocks. Right, so this AT that we see here is the same as what we've seen in other models, where it's a source of technology shocks. It's a source of, it explains how firms get new ideas and then implement those ideas to basically produce in a way that is more efficient for them. Now, these technology shocks can come in the way of just total factor productivity shocks. They can come in the way of capital augmenting technology or labor augmenting technology. Here we are assuming that it's like a total factor productivity thing. So it's going to be affecting the way production is done on both the capital and labor axes. Right, now, any demand curve, right, is going to have what slope? Take a minute to think about that. Think about that while I set up the graph. And if you considered what that was and you thought about it for a second, you probably converge on the idea that it is downward sloping. And you would be correct to do so. Labor demand is downward sloping. when graphed along the axes of labor and wages. Right, so it's downward sloping in wages. As the wage rate goes up, the amount of labor the firm will demand will fall. Now, why is that? Well, for one, the firm can really only afford to pay so much before, well, they can't pay you anymore. Right? Well, yeah, that's pretty much it. At least what we'll be concerned about in this lecture. Now, simultaneously, remember that what we had was the household's problem. Now, I'm not going to go through all that math again. One, it's not terribly important, and two, it's kind of already been done in that last lecture video. So the household maximizes utility. And remember, utility was this. So utility was a function of consumption, CT, leisure, NT. Remember, NT stood for not doing shit, and money, or real money balances. NT was leisure, is equal to 1 minus LT. Right, so if every period has a length of 1, we can separate that period in terms of labor and leisure by, well, the amount of that day that you spend sitting on your ass doing nothing, and the amount of the day that you go to work and hate going to work. And that gives us a labor supply of this. All right, so this is the labor supply. So the firm demands labor, right? The firm needs labor in order to be able to produce. The household supplies labor based on, well, how much they would rather consume relative to how much they would rather sit on their butt. Right? And that led to the consumption-leisure trade-off that we talked about a little bit, where sitting on your ass is great, but doing so doesn't generate any labor income. All right? We can just assume for a second it doesn't generate any income at all. So if it doesn't generate income, well, that's nice, but it doesn't mean you get to consume very much stuff. So if you want to be able to consume more, you have to be willing to work more. And that sort of explains the labor supply equation. Right, so if you think, or if you consider that labor demand was downward sloping, you would probably be in the right ballpark, we can say, of assuming that labor supply would be upward sloping. Give me just one moment. So, if we were to draw labor supply, and my apologies about that pause. Well, labor supply, call it LTS, right? What is that going to be? Well, that's going to be a function, call it L, of the wage rate and, well, other stuff. What's the other stuff that it's going to be a function of? Well, just call it HT. All right, so obviously the higher the wage rate, the more you're willing to work. But there's other stuff as well. Well, this HT basically accounts for all that other stuff. And what is all that other stuff? Well, we can just let HT stuff like preferences and things other than the wage that affect labor supply. So if we were to graph labor supply here, well, what we would get is this. So we get this upward sloping labor supply curve, right, because it's increasing in wages. And where the two intersect is where we get our equilibrium in the labor market. We can call that LT star, and we can call this WT star. Right, so if you remember, when we had our labor supply, this is what we got in that model. we could say that the labor demand was which came from the firm side, if you remember. Is equal to this. All right, so labor demand, the marginal product of labor, being equal to the wage rate, which is equal to the household's labor supply. All right, so in equilibrium, labor supply which is equal to the real wage rate, is also equal to the marginal product of labor, like that. All right, so this is the equilibrium, which is defined by this point right here. So let's talk about a couple of things that will shift labor supply around. All right, what's going to shift the supply for labor around? Well, let's see. Technically speaking, what's going to shift labor supply is anything that's not either the wage rate or labor. Okay, so what do I mean by that? Well, if we look at labor supply is a function L, the real wage rate, and then HT. Well, if the wage rate changes, right, wage rate is on the graph, which means if we change the wage rate, right, you're just going to move to a new point somewhere along this labor supply curve. So if W changes, well, nothing really happens. Well, I mean, stuff happens, but the curve doesn't shift. What about HT? Well, if that changes, then labor supply will shift. So what would cause H to change? What would cause, if H changes, right? What causes H to change, and then what causes that to move the labor supply curve in one way or the other? Well, let's think about preferences, right? Let's say you'd rather work more, right? Let's say you just wake up one day and you're like, you know, I've been a really lazy piece of shit these days, and I'm kind of tired of being like super lazy like that. I would rather be more productive. Okay, what happens? Well, then HT would increase. HT goes up, labor supply will shift out. So if you decide you want to work more hours, will just shift outward like this. Felt like LTS prime is a function of the wage rate and HT prime. Right? If you decide, on the other hand, that you'd really rather not work anymore, right, you don't care to work as much, well, then it would shift the other way. But there's other stuff besides just that, right? Let's think about what happens if, like, say there's some kind of a labor supply shock in the sense of, like, major population increase, like a sudden population increase. What would happen then? Well, that would cause labor supply to also shift out. Right, so anything that will be affecting the labor markets that isn't the wage rate or labor will be reflected through a change in HT. Okay, cool. Well, let's think about what's going to shift labor demand around a little bit. What will shift labor demand? Well, in short, again, anything that's not labor or wages. So if the wage rate goes up, well, there's no shift in labor demand. All right, because that's already been accounted for within the graph. So we move to a new point on the labor demand curve. All right, but if, let's see, well, what's labor demand a function of? Well, it's a function of the real wage rate, capital, and total factor productivity shocks. Okay. Well, the one that I'm more interested in than anything else would be total factor productivity shocks. So let's suppose there's a technology shock, right? AT goes up. What's going to happen? Well, if firms can produce stuff more efficiently, right, without going through all the mechanisms on how that works, because, well, that would kind of defeat the purpose of this entire set of lectures. If there's a technology shock, a positive technology shock, when that happens, labor demand will shift out. Firms will demand more labor. I probably don't want to use that. Let's see. I'm going to use pink. I got green here. Maybe green will work. So green looks cool. Well, like LTD prime is a function L, the real wage rate, capital, and like AT prime. All right, and that would be an outward shift or a rightward shift in labor demand. So that will explain how labor markets operate under the real business cycle model. The next lecture is going to break down the production function, right, how production operates. We'll explain the source of total factor productivity shocks a little bit more there. And then we will, in that lecture, basically combine production and labor markets, and we will see how we can get an aggregate supply curve from there. So thank you for watching, and see you next time on Real Business Cycles with Jeremy on NyQuil, even though I'm not on NyQuil.